Hello, everybody. Good morning, and thanks for joining this session on the path to COP26. My name is Thomas Serkovich, and on behalf of Business in the Community Ireland, we're delighted to be co-hosting this session with our member company, SSE, on something that is so critical and so important for businesses as well as for policy and for all of us in general. So let me give you a sense of what's going to be happening this morning. And let's start obviously by firstly welcoming the more than 200 people that we have registered this morning, representing a real cross-section of business, civil society organizations, business networks, academia, as well as government. So you're all very, very welcome, and we were delighted to see such positive response. Then, as you can see on your screen, in terms of very quick housekeeping, number one, we are recording the webinar because we want to share it online. Number two, we strongly encourage interaction and participation. The Q&A box has been set aside for any questions, comments, technical issues that you might have. And colleagues from Business in the Community and SSE are the other end of the line, making sure that any queries are resolved, and there will be a Q&A timing towards the end of the session. There's a hashtag, as everywhere, COP26. That's an easy one, and please do tag us SSE Ireland and at the ITC Ireland. So I'm very much looking forward to this session, and let me tell you what we are going to be doing. I'm going to take a few minutes just to give a brief introduction on COP and COP26, just to set the real basic foundations. Then we're going to move into a panel. We have three great speakers joining us this morning. I'll introduce them. We'll have a conversation around what are the issues at stake from a business perspective, what do we really expect from COP26, and then we'll take it from there in terms of next steps and interaction from the audience. So let's, I think we should go straight into it. And of course, we're here to talk this morning about COP26, and it's a great week to be talking about it. This Thursday is Earth Day, but it is also Joe Biden's climate summit. And I think it's going to be very significant for the conversation we're having this morning in terms of what is going to emanate from that. I'll talk in a second about nationally determined contributions, but the world is looking at the United States and looking at what level of ambition, agenda, and practical implementation they're going to bring to the table. And also, you know, we're in the middle of a pandemic. And last year, we estimate that in average, global emissions were reduced by 7%. And that was on foot of having probably a quarter or more of the world economy stalled at any given moment in time. We're sadly seeing emissions coming up and ramping up quite quickly. And we all know that this is an existential issue. We all know that this is the decade in which everything has to happen if we want to really reverse a very catastrophic climate change, and if we really want to reverse the path in which we're going that is not positive for the planet and for our society. So let's talk about COP for a second. And obviously, you know, the conference of the parties, that's the first thing. Secondly, we know that the COP is the representation of all the signatories to the United Nations Framework Conference on Climate Change, and that's where decision making is made. Some COPs are very well known, as is Paris, and we'll come back to Paris, and others are less known, maybe because they're not so successful. But the first thing that is going to be looked at in COP26, and it is critical that we all pay attention to, is what it's called the National Determined Contributions, or NDCs, which in my head translate to the net zero or the decarbonization action plans for various different countries. And this is something that will be very much looked at, because 6 years ago in Paris, all world nations agreed that we needed to take determined action to limit global warming, that it couldn't go above 2 degrees, and then we brought it down to 1.5 degrees centigrades, because that was very dangerous for human existence. And in order to do that, each country has to put forward its national action plan. We know that Ireland has published a climate bill a few weeks ago that's passing through the Oireachtas, and we also know that that climate bill is aligned with the EU, because Ireland goes as a bloc to this negotiations, which is about reducing emissions by 55% by 2030 compared to 1990. So quite a challenging approach. At the end of the day, the EU, Japan, Britain, they all have a net zero 2050 approach. And we know that's a fabulous target, but we need to make meaningful, significant change over the next decade. We know that China has made a 2060 net zero commitment, and we're all very eager to see what will happen in the United States this week and where will this be going forward. In the next slide, I just want to take a moment to discuss what is it that it's at stake, because we all think, and today we're 195 days away from the 1st of November, which is the official start of COP26. And we can put a question mark there. Is it still happening? Is it going to be virtual? Is it going to be postponed? At the end of the day, that's not the key message. That's not what matters, because significant amount of work is happening already. Negotiations, rounds of talks, commitments, pledges, all of that is happening right now. So it's a very busy set of negotiations. And at the end of the day, what we all need to do is to get a very strong mandate to carry on what was agreed in Paris. So Glasgow is going to be a complex place, and it's very much about the governments negotiating in one room, but it's also about civil society and business playing a very critical role there as well, as we're going to see. So in the next slide, I just want to talk a little bit about who is going to be there. So as I was saying, there is a number of different parties. At the end of the day, the negotiation, the outcomes will be thanks to or in detriment of governments, but clearly business, which is what we're going to discuss today, are going to play a key role. And the discussion is not going to be just about the various emission reduction targets, because as we all know, this is a very interrelated agenda. So obviously it's going to be conversations around technology that will enable sectors to reduce their emissions. It's going to be about the finance required to access that technology. It's going to be about how climate will affect issues such as health, education, gender. So it's really fascinating and multifaceted. And I think that's on the next slide, where you can see where some of the key topics are going to be. And then the final thing I would say, I think this is the final slide. At the beginning, COP was very much about the governments negotiating. But if you fast forward to Paris, in Paris, it was the first COP where we had as many businesses as we had governments represented. And that's really important, because that shows the relevance that the climate agenda has for business, but also for other civil society organizations. And again, if I had spoken to you a few years ago about Greta Thunberg, Fridays for the Future, Extinction Rebellion, civil society is gearing up. And civil society has very high hopes and expectations, and that's something that will be very important that it's taken forward. At the end of the day, we're in the middle, as I was saying, of the pandemic. We need to build back better, and the eyes of the world will be on COP26 to see if there's real mandate, if there's real ambition to make the change that it's quite radical and transformational. So I'm going to stop there, because I think it's better to talk to experts rather than listening to me. And what I want to do now is to invite our panelists to join us. So I'm delighted that we have with us different voices and different perspectives. So Susan Albrecht is joining us from the United Nations Development Programme, and she's a climate policy specialist. Stephen Wheeler is the Ireland country lead of SSE, and Fiona Macklin is the campaign coordinator of the Race to Zero campaign. So I'm going to ask Suzanne and Fiona to turn on their cameras and Stephen to join us virtually. Stephen, I know you're on audio, so we can hopefully hear all of you very, very clearly. And what I'd like to do is start by inviting our panelists to give a brief introduction to their area of work, because maybe some of the initiatives that you're working on may not be that well known here in Ireland, and take it from there in terms of the conversation. So Suzanne, I might start with you, and I know you're in Bonn, Germany, joining us, and so I'd like to know a little bit about the work of the UNDP, the Development Programme of the United Nations, when it comes to COP26 and incentivizing private sector engagement around this. And can I start with a very broad question, I guess? What do you think are the key issues at stake at COP26?
Thanks, Thomas, and good morning, everyone. My name is Susanne Olbrecht, and I've been working with the United Nations Development Programme, UNDP, in New York since 2008. Before that, I was working with UNESCO in Bangkok and with the United Nations Environment Programme in Nairobi in Kenya. In New York, I'm part of a team working on climate change with UNDP, and my role and focus is on climate finance. So as you may know, apart from its New York headquarters, UNDP has offices in 170 countries worldwide, and UNDP works with countries across Latin America, Africa, and Asia on sustainable development. And yes, as we were saying, there's lots of expectations, a lot at stake for COP26, and it has been a super exceptional year in several regards, obviously. So one, in terms of the pandemic, most countries have been facing large challenges and governments have been busy over the past year to address them. UNDP is working to support countries on green recovery with the idea to use this deep cut in economies to make sure that the economic support helps to set economies on a track that is green and that is sustainable and that helps countries to really build back better. So one expectation definitely is to see how countries are doing that. Then the second point that was, of course, super exceptional over the past year is over this year, countries are supposed to come up with their revised nationally determined contributions, the NDCs, the National Climate Pledges. And we know that since the Paris Agreement came into play in 2015, countries have committed themselves to revise them all 5 years and to make them more ambitious. And of course, all eyes are now on NDC preparation in different countries ahead of COP26. So really the strong expectation is to see countries, particularly G20, G7 countries, to step up their ambition and to demonstrate strong commitment in achieving the Paris Agreement goals.
Super. Thanks, Suzanne. I think it's a good foundation, and clearly over the next weeks and months we'll be seeing more about how these issues pan out and what's going to be, all the deals and the last minute negotiations on what's coming that way, and I think it'll be interesting also to reflect what does the Build Back Better mean in terms of the rebuilding economies. And I was at a session yesterday and there was a lot of conversation about the conditionality, for instance, in terms of supporting sectors depressed or affected by the pandemic, and how now it is a great opportunity to look at that. So Fiona, I might turn to you then. And Alok Sharma is the president of COP26, and I was looking at. He tweeted the other day congratulating Volvo because they were one of the latest companies to join the race to zero, and talking about the importance of the automotive sector in playing a role in this. So can you give us a sense of what is a race to zero, and what sort of role are you expecting to play within the whole context of COP26?
Absolutely, thank you so much, Thomas, and it's wonderful to be here. Hi, everyone, and huge thanks to all our hosts for putting this event together. My name is Fiona Macklin, and I joined the Climate Champions team back in December to lead on the Race to Zero, and which is a campaign that is led by the high-level champions for climate action, Nigel Topping and Gonzalo Munoz. And their mandate is really to bridge the gap between non-state actors and national governments and really drive this convergence to deliver on the promise of Paris, with everyone across society very much playing their part. So Race to Zero was launched back in June last year, really in a time of growing confusion around what the concept of net zero is, with a lot of different commitments coming together, meaning different things, and creating a lot of confusion around what we're aiming for. So the campaign is really designed to cut through this noise and create a very clear and credible standard for what commitments and credible climate action need to look like. And it was launched very much to establish the standard and accelerate momentum to catalyze action towards COP26 and bring all non-state actors on board. So it's the largest credible alliance of non-state actors across society. We've got businesses, universities, cities, regions, investors, really looking to bring them together and amplify their voice so that we can activate what we're calling this ambition loop. So it's calling on national governments to ratchet, as Suzanne was mentioning, their NDCs, but providing the infrastructure beneath them, thanks to non-state actors, so that they can achieve that goal. So really looking to bridge this gap between non-state actors and national governments through the Race to Zero.
Super. And can I ask you something else, Fiona? Because obviously you're right. I mean, understanding what net zero is there a sort of a clear call to action from the Race to Zero campaign when it comes to businesses specifically that are looking at this initiative?
There absolutely is, and thanks for the question, Thomas. It's very much about aligning with the science and joining Race to Zero. That is the clear call to action, but to sort of underpin that a little bit, or unpick that rather, it's about three things mainly. It's about bringing businesses and helping them understand what is needed, so what's driven by the science. As Suzanne was mentioning, and as we all know, it's been a very, very strange year with COVID, but against the odds, it was a year of unprecedented climate action. And so despite growing emissions, still we have seen organizations rallying together. And so it's about tackling these systemic risks up front and preventing rather than having to cure. So the call is to join and commit to these credible standards because of what is needed. But it's also to sort of understand what's possible. It's showcasing what is underway, the technology and the knowledge that we're learning so rapidly, and the innovations that are becoming very visible. And the automotive industry, you mentioned Volvo, is a perfect example of an industry that has accelerated at an incredible pace. And so we're looking to bring actors together, because it's only through radical collaboration that we can keep moving the line of what is possible. And finally, it's about recognizing what's underway and businesses pivoting their business models, businesses investing in climate action, businesses looking to change their ways of living, not because that's a sacrifice, but on the contrary, because those are clear opportunities. They will attract the best talent, they will attract investment. And so it's about taking those actions and joining the Race to Zero ahead of COP.
Absolutely, and without a doubt, it's been also unprecedented in terms of the response of the interest of the investor community when looking at this whole agenda, which I think it's really exciting. Stephen, we can hear you, but we can't see you, unfortunately. But we're very much looking forward to engaging with you this morning as well. So could I ask, from the perspective of SSE, what has been the journey so far when facing this sort of expectation and mandate of net zero and decarbonizing electricity, which at the end of the day is so critical for everything we do?
Hi, Thomas. Great to be with you. Can you hear me properly? I'm just checking.
Perfectly, yes.
Perfect. And yes, and apologies again. My home IT system let me down this morning, I'm afraid. So I've had to dial in. Look, it's great to be here. It's great to be part of this conversation. I think an incredibly important conversation, particularly with COP26 only 6 months away. And look, we're a principal partner, and we're incredibly proud to be a principal partner. It completely aligns to our strategy of delivering on net zero by 2050. So we're working with governments in the UK, but also the Irish government, to really ensure that this is a real successful COP26, that we move from ambition and promises to action, and that's something we're inherently are really intent on doing. From our own journey's point of view, Thomas, it's interesting when you actually look back over the history of SSE, and the group as we are today came together through the privatization of two utilities back in the 1990s. And what it created at that time was one of the biggest utilities in the UK. But we were also one of the largest CO2 emitters. Back in the day, we were emitting over 20 million tons of carbon dioxide per annum. 50% of our generation was coming from coal. So there was a place and time for coal. We very much realized that actually the strategic direction, both financially and environmentally, was to actually start moving towards renewables. And that aligned to the 2007-2008 when EU adopted the 20% target for renewables. We had a small business in renewables at the time. We recognized the need to really grow that. And through the acquisition of electricity in 2008, that really put us at the forefront of renewable energy, and with a big focus, really pivoting the business towards wind energy. And over the last 15 years, we've consistently moved, to more and more greener electricity. A couple of highlights in 2012, we opened the Greater Gabbard offshore wind farm. It was the largest wind farm at the time. We also opened the Clyde onshore wind farm, largest onshore wind farm in Europe at the time, over 500 megawatts. So these were really large capital projects that we were delivering. Moving forward then, we come up to 2019. That was another real pivotal year for us. We actually closed our last coal-fired station in 2019 at Fiddler's Ferry, and we opened Scotland's largest offshore wind. So very much closing the old, but actually opening where the future was, which was the offshore wind. We also, around about that time, we decided we needed to get serious about our targets. We looked at how we were going to reduce our carbon emission intensity and what ambition should we have. And in 2017, 2018, we set ourselves, in the late 2010s, we set ourselves a target to cut our carbon intensity by 50%. We met that by 2020, and we met that in 2017. At the same time, we opened, Ireland's largest wind farm in Galway. So, we were very much moving on the journey. The environment side of the ESG factors were really starting to take hold within the business. And in 2019, I think is probably our most pivotal, as well as closing coal, as I mentioned earlier. We made a number of changes organizationally. We recruited our Chief Sustainability Officer. We were doing a lot of work in the area, but we really wanted to pull this together in a coordinated fashion right across the piece. We aligned our overall objectives of the business to the UN sustainability goals. So no surprises, we were focusing on offshore wind, we were focusing on carbon CO2 reductions, we were focusing on electric vehicle rollout. And we also took the bold move, which I think is the correct move, where we actually said, look, we aren't going to just talk about this, we're actually going to align our remuneration or our bonuses to achieving these goals. So a big cultural and structural change within that. Where we are today is we're now the largest renewable energy company in Ireland and the UK. Right now, no one is building any bigger or more offshore wind than SSE. We're building Dogger Bank in the UK, which when built will be the largest offshore wind farm in the world. We've a large pipeline in Ireland. We've significant ambition to really, build on our current position as the #1 onshore operator of onshore wind. We've major plans for offshore wind. We see offshore wind as a real critical enabler of our climate action plan here in Ireland, and so we're continually progressing our growth through renewables. As importantly, we're not just looking from the environmental side. We're also saying, as a company, we have standards and sustainability standards to live up to. We're a member of the Fair Tax. We're one of the first companies to adopt the living wage employer. And also, we're looking at this. The transition to net zero by 2050, will come with some challenges. We need to bring everybody with us. We need to bring communities right with us. So we're very focused on our overall just transition strategy. And I suppose the last thing just to mention is, as a company, this has been an evolution. We're now getting to a point where climate change needs to be tackled on a revolution basis. But through our evolution, we've progressed through our targets. And now in the last, over a year, we've set science-based targets for carbon reduction, to limit global warming to less than 1.5 degrees by 2050. We're obviously proud members of actually Race to Zero. So these are all different parts of the journey that we've taken. So I think that brings us up to date, Thomas.
That's a fabulous track record, I would say, and I do want to come back to your journey on the race to zero, and we'll ask Fiona for some input. But clearly, Stephen, you're summarizing, several years of very hard work into a few minutes. But I think the ultimate question when it comes to sustainability is there demand? And I'm sure you work with public sector, with multinationals coming into Ireland. What's your perception of how that demand is evolving and shifting from a nice to have to a must have when it comes to renewables?
Yeah, I think it just goes back to, as one of the largest emitters in the UK, we had to act and we had to take action. And we've done that. But most importantly, it makes financial sense. It makes strategic sense. It makes environmental sense. For our staff, it makes ethical sense. For our company, it makes ethical sense. So whilst we started the journey back in probably 2007, 2008, what you're seeing now is a real urgency. There's a real understanding that climate change is the biggest challenge of our generation. Like pre-say, COVID has set unprecedented changes right now, but we will come through this. We will build back better. And what we're seeing is large multinationals really jumping now on this journey, with clear mandates about what they're going to do to reach, 1.5 degrees, or to support 1.5 degrees, limit the global warming to 1.5 degrees, and help us reach net zero by 2050. Because the reality is, this is such a challenge. It is a societal challenge. This can only be resolved right across society. So it's businesses, it's every stakeholders, every actors which participate in the world, all society will contribute to delivering on the overall ambition and target here. And the reality is, it's a challenge that it needs 100% focus right across.
Yeah, no, absolutely, yes. And I consider already some really good questions coming up on the Q&A. So thanks for that, and we will come back to that. But thanks, Stephen. Fiona, can I come back to you for a second and then just understand, for a company that's interested in the race to zero, what's the expectation? What's the ask? How do they engage? How do we build sort of collective momentum when it comes to the build up to Glasgow?
Absolutely, Thomas, and it's really, really inspiring seeing or hearing rather Stephen explain what SSE has done. And I think that's very much what we're trying to pull out broadly from the campaign, is these fantastic examples of actual action and that transition that is taking place. In terms of specifically joining, the structure of Race to Zero is such that we partner with leading initiatives, as I mentioned earlier, who are partners to the campaign, and they then act as secretariats through which they're funneling through individual members. So we have the likes of Business Ambition for 1.5 or the Climate Pledge or SME Climate Hub, and these then are bringing in the individual actors into the campaign. To join, an individual member therefore specifically applies to one of those partner initiatives, but overall they have to meet really stringent criteria which underpin the credibility of Race to Zero. And these criteria are divided into 3 parts broadly. So one is what we call the 4 Ps, and this is about pledging at the head of organization level to achieve net zero by 2050, but also within that, you're committing to your fair share of halving emissions by 2030. So very much both long-term and short-term, crucially, action. The second P is about planning. We want to see a really clear action plan that organizations will have, which will get them to those targets. We then want to see, the third P is proceed. So we want to see meaningful action being taken from the get-go, no longer kicking the can down the road. And finally, we want to see annual publications against both short-term and long-term targets for that transparency, but also to be able to provide support where we see organizations perhaps struggling or not knowing where to go next. So those are the 4 Ps, and broadly underpinning that is also, to Stephen's point, this sense of the need for policy advocacy as well, and sharing this information with communities more broadly. The second part of the criteria is around scopes and sources and things. So firstly, in order for climate action to be truly credible, it can't just be an individual kind of direct scope 1 action. It has to cover all scopes. And in covering all scopes, organizations will therefore snowball action and will be communicating, will be seeing these links across the global economy, across supply chains. We also want to get away from this idea that net zero is synonymous to offsetting. This is not an offsetting campaign. It is about reducing emissions immediately. Of course, there are needs to neutralize residual emissions. And to the point that I noticed in the chat, there are definitely untested technologies that are out there that we, to some extent, have to depend on to get to global net zero by 2050. But there are immediate abatement measures that have to be taken today that are the absolute focus of this campaign. And then a final point, again, I'm really pleased that Stephen raised this, is a point about leadership principles. This is not just about climate action, it is about the broad remit of being an ethical, moral, just organization that is working towards that fair and resilient transition. So it's about really taking care not to create other issues just by addressing this climate issue specifically. Those are the criteria that organizations have to meet in order to join the campaign. And broadly, to echo Stephen's message, this is about opportunity. It's not about sacrifice. It's about pinning these criteria to be opportunities to get that financial, strategic, environmental advantage, also to be a more popular business. We're seeing the younger generation come in and calling so loudly for credible climate action. So it's an opportunity for these businesses to get platforms at events, to have support to kind of jump into this ecosystem where we are looking to build connections across multi-stakeholder actors to really bring together areas of society that have previously not worked together and drive convergence and forge those connections.
Thank you. Yeah, no, I think it's interesting because we have an initiative here in Ireland which is around a low carbon pledge that the business and community is running. So I think listening to your 4 Ps, there's quite a lot of alignment, and maybe it's something we should see an opportunity to joining forces. I guess one of the questions that were asked a lot, Fiona, and I don't know if it's the case with the race to zero, is about small companies, small and medium-sized enterprises, which in a country like this is the vast majority of employment, the vast majority of businesses are small and medium, and some of these initiatives seem to be for like big names, Volvo, for example, as we were discussing earlier. Are you seeing anything interesting in relation to sort of the supply chain engagement or small companies themselves playing a role in this? Because I'm sure that's something that will be quite prominent for businesses everywhere.
Absolutely, and it's definitely the largest cohort of businesses that we have in Race to Zero are small and medium-sized enterprises, and it's brilliant to see the SME Climate Hub, which is acting as the partner initiative that is funding through those SMEs, and they are providing tools, they're providing knowledge, they're providing that access to information and to support the SMEs don't necessarily always have compared to the much larger organizations that can afford much more resources to do this. I also think, just to pull out on that, it's fantastic, like you mentioned, to see the role of SMEs in the supply chain, and they play a fundamental part in helping to transition broader supply chains. They also play, I think, a very important role these days. Smaller organizations are usually more technologically kind of perhaps savvy, or they are adapting immediately to the environment and to the circumstances. And so it's really important for them to see how they can go beyond that fair share of halving emissions. It's not just about, it's a halving emissions target for everyone, so we'll only do 50%. Often these SMEs are the ones that are driving way beyond that in sectors that can take the lead and then help harder to abate sectors or large organizations that might be perhaps less flexible to move. So they play a really, really key role and are being increasingly kind of continuing to drive that ambition. So it's absolutely crucial to bring them on board and to learn from them in how we're continuing to accelerate this transition and take immediate action.
Absolutely. So small is beautiful. I guess that still stands when it comes to SMEs. Suzanne, can I come over to you, because obviously from a UNDP perspective, you're looking at a very global dimension, and I was remiss earlier to talk about the fact that, for instance, least developed countries have a very different agenda when it comes to COP than industrialized nations. They have very different challenges. So from your lens, which are quite global, what other ways do you see private sector, the business community, engaging on climate action within the context of COP?
Definitely, thank you. One really umbrella framework under which UNDP is currently supporting countries is the UNDP Climate Promise. So that's really the global effort under which UNDP is currently supporting 118 countries in collaboration with 35 partners. And that includes work on recovery, work on energy, work on across different sectors. And yes, I couldn't agree more with what Fiona was already mentioning. Also in our work, we see a wealth of different examples that we could share here of what countries are doing to really bring in the private sector and really walk the talk from NDC development really to implementation. Just to pick a few examples from different countries. One that I really want to highlight is the Huella Chile project. That means Footprint Chile, which is a program in Chile, to promote GHG management in public and private organizations to mitigate the country's total GHG emission. This program helps companies to set up their own carbon footprint calculation, to implement it and to improve it over time. And this program now engages more than 1,200 private companies within Chile.
Wow.
So it's pretty massive. Another example from a different part of the world is in Vietnam. There we have supported the establishment of an online platform that is called the Climate Business Index that was established to engage private sector entities in NDC implementation. So private sector companies can register and depending on their level of engagement can take up 1 out of 3 levels of ambition that they have different commitments associated with them. So level 1 is just registering and become a climate aware company. And then level 2 is become a climate action taker. And level 3 is becoming a climate leader where companies are really doing bold action. And eventually that platform develops into a national disclosure and assessment system for the business community in Vietnam. Yet a third example from a different region would be in Lebanon. So in Lebanon, the Lebanon Green Investment Facility has been set up to accelerate private sector climate finance and implementation. So activities under this investment facility include drafting design documents, drafting bylaws, drafting a results framework and monitoring and evaluation scheme in consultation with stakeholders. So the access for financing for climate informed activities would be through grants, soft loans, interest rate subsidies, and loan guarantees. So there are many examples to share really. Maybe just in general also to say that we do see like so many entry points for the private sector really to come into that. And in all those countries that we're working with, really non-state actors play an important role. And we know that public funding can only cover a fraction of what is needed, and that public funding often can be used wisely to rather leverage private sector funding. And we see this especially in the energy sector, that there's lots of potential where countries sometimes literally are able to leapfrog if they phase out old energy generation facilities or exchange end user appliances.
And thanks, Suzanne, because I think that's really interesting to get the global picture. I mean, if you had to point to a specific or what would you see as the main sort of challenge that businesses face? Do you think it's around capacity? Do you think it's about finance? Is it about mindset shifts, which we were discussing earlier? What would you point out?
I think the one aspect that I would like to pick is really that from our experience at UNDP, there are, well, first and foremost, we know that the private sector does not operate according to a project logic, but it needs favorable and stable conditions to make a business case for action. And in that regard, we are particularly pleased to see that the EU, for instance, is coming up with what we call the EU taxonomy, with this idea really being to meet the EU's climate and energy targets for 2030 and to reach the objectives of the European Green Deal, that is fundamental to direct investments towards sustainable activities. So then the question is, what is sustainable activities? So in this EU taxonomy, it established a classification system for sustainable economic activities, and it has like 6 different objectives or dimensions, so to speak. It covers climate change mitigation, climate change adaptation, sustainable use and protection of water and marine resources, transition to circular economy, pollution and prevention control, and then lastly, protection and restoration of biodiversity and ecosystems. So really the benefits that are expected from that is to create security for investors, to protect private investors from greenwashing, to help companies to plan a transition towards sustainability, and to mitigate also this market fragmentation and shifting investments where they're really needed. So along these lines, the EU Commission is preparing an IT tool to facilitate the use of this taxonomy, as well as Excel tools to help users to implement the taxonomy in their own activities. So we would hope that this would put a positive impetus and some stable planning framework also that the private sector just needs.
Super. Yeah, no, and I think thanks for mentioning the taxonomy, because again, it's one of those EU initiatives that sometimes it gets time to get our head around what it really means. But you've explained very clearly, and again, back to the points that Fiona and Stephen were making, it's about the opportunity as much as it is about hard work. It is the opportunity that's there for businesses. Stephen, can I come back to you for a second time and ask, you know, SSE is a principal partner of COP26. What does that mean for your company to be associated with this process?
Well, thanks, Thomas. In the first instance, it makes absolute sense when you look at our overall strategy to help and deliver on a net zero target by 2050. You know, being a partner with COP26 is incredibly important, and particularly even from a staff point of view, that there's a real association with something that's critical, with something that's really significant, and it's a real opportunity to make a difference. I think the second point is actually, by being a partner and working with UK government to support it, you know, our overall aim is to drive home the message, and right across our business, right across all our partners, right across who we do business with, you know, drive home the message that bold action is needed to address climate change. I think we've been really good on ambition. We've been really good on promises. COP26 in Glasgow is a real opportunity now to really turn that into bold action. And I think both Susanna and Fiona mentioned it before, the importance of actually being able to measure that action. I think from an Irish government point of view, the Climate Action Bill is a real ambitious step in doing that, and they deserve great credit. And from our point of view, being associated with COP26 is just another way that we can actually help support the delivery of that. I think the other piece is, you know, it's easy to be kind of lost and stuck in what's happened over the last 12 months, and I think society in general have just responded incredibly well to come through COVID. We're still in the middle, you know, we're not out of it yet, and probably will go on for some time, but like a society, I think society deserves great credit. But at the same time, we also need to look at, as we come out of COVID, climate change is without doubt the biggest challenge of our generation, and it's there. It's going to be waiting. So to me, you know, COP26 and our association with that, it's just about doing something about climate change. It's really about getting this right now and building a more sustainable economy for future generations. You've talked about the opportunity. There's huge opportunity around climate change, and that's how we need to get businesses, people, society thinking. Whilst it's challenging, there is huge opportunity here, and I think the other piece and why it makes real sense for us to be partners with COP26, it's not just about reducing carbon emissions, obviously hugely important, but as importantly is actually the just transition element. And again, that's completely aligned to our overall company strategy, that no one gets left behind. This is about reskilling, about creating jobs, about creating sustainable investment for future generations, and delivering on, as I said, what is so critical is actually dealing with climate change. You only have to look at what's happening around the world to see the impacts of climate change. This is the generation that we need to step up and do something about it, and being part of COP26 allows us to play a small but important part in helping that.
No, and thank you for mentioning the just transition, because I think it's something that it gets at least frequently overlooked in the sort of the conferences and the webinars that I attend. So hopefully they will have time and get some inputs from Fiona and Suzanne around that. But let's go to some of the questions, because there's some interesting questions. There's a very concrete one here for you, Stephen. We're talking about opportunities. There's a question around electric vehicles. And the question from Vincent is, what do you see as the most significant challenge to vehicle electrification in Ireland from your perspective? So I'm sure everybody's asking that.
Yeah, look, electric vehicles are here, they're coming. There's no doubt that they will replace combustion engines over the next 5 to 10 years. I believe, there's lots of challenges. There's technical challenges, obviously the infrastructure, but great companies like ESB and Airgrid in Ireland are looking to resolve that and have invested over the last number of years to really progress that. In the UK, obviously our own networks company is investing both at the transmission and network level. So, there is significant overhaul. What we're trying to do here in the challenge is we're completely reimagining how the energy system of the future will work. And with that comes challenge, but with that also comes opportunity. So from an electric vehicle point of view, big focus on the network. Obviously, then we need to look then at the affordability and how that's actually, how that's supported. So a number of challenges, but nothing insurmountable.
Fair enough. Good. It's good to hear that. I was at a presentation this morning and they were talking about the explosion of EVs and electric vehicles, and it was impressive to see China and how they have grown, so that this is not just a Western perspective. I want to bring, there's two questions here from Ali and from Peter, which I think are really important, and they're about the balance between the net zero 2050, and that looks fabulous, but still far away, and this decade of action to 2030. And the questions relate to how do we achieve that balance? Is there a risk that we over depend on the 2030 to 2050 period to provide us with all the amazing technologies that will make abatement happen overnight, between inverted commas? And is there a risk that we're over focusing on 2050 and not enough on the more immediate? Suzanne, could I bring you first to what's your view on that balance or imbalance, and what do you think is the solution that COP needs to look at?
Sure, thank you. And thanks for the question. It's obviously spot on, and it's also a consideration that we are also dealing with a lot. Do we risk that some countries may, use the every 5 years a revision process to also postpone some of the potential activity for later rather than doing all the effort now? And yes, of course, that's what we do not want to see in countries, is that a potential waiting game takes place in, who is moving first. I must say, what we see, at least in many countries that we are working with, is very encouraging, that we see increasing pressure and action really by civil society, by private sector actors who often go first, even before there's regulations or even before there's a clear pressure or mandate from the public side placed on them. And we see that this also interacts with the government and with the regulations that are being put up, and we see that there is a positive dynamic taking place, at least in some regions, but it's definitely something that we are working on. And I think one key for us to that is really to try and encourage and work on this green recovery aspect, because we just see that in the face of the pandemic, there's reaction, of course, in many economies being totally overwhelmed, having massive expenditures on other ends than climate change, at least as it looks on the first look. And really by bringing this together, by recovering, by building back better, while at the same time creating employment, I think that's really at the heart of our mandate. For UNDP, being a development organization, the well-being of people is really, of course, at the heart of our mandate, and leaving no one behind. So yes, it's really about that.
Great, thank you, Suzanne. Fiona, can I put the same question to you, in that balance of a lot of action to 2030, but then the real abatement will happen later on?
Absolutely, and just to say, I mean, looking through all the questions, they're phenomenal questions. They're so pertinent, and it's great to see such engagement from the audience, because this is exactly what we're grappling with from a campaign's perspective. But for this point, absolutely, it is all about 2030. Especially because the leaders, the CEOs, the mayors that are in place now will not be here post 2030 most likely, and so it's about what actions they are making, they're taking from now, and that's very much a core part of Race to Zero as a campaign. From the planning and the proceeding perspective, is absolutely focusing on what actions are you taking from now, what is going to be happening over the next 12 months even for you to be taking this. So it's about investing in technologies, in nature-based solutions, in pivoting those business models, creating transition plans, but it's also about implementing things like supply chain criteria, membership organizations that have all this power just through a piece of text almost to say, we will work with you if you meet certain criteria. So it's things like that that are really crucial to start snowballing this impact. It's also about education. It's about mainstreaming this narrative of what credible action is, and that needs to happen and is already happening. But once we all get to the same level of understanding of the absolute minimum standard for a true credible climate commitment and climate action, then we will all be moving towards the same goal very quickly. And so we absolutely have to focus on the halving of emissions by 2030 and on action in the next 12 months. And it's only by getting there in the first place that we'll be able to work then towards decarbonisation by 2050.
Thank you. No, I think that gives a good sense that even, again, a session I was this morning, people were talking about beyond 2050 and regenerative ecology and how we even need to do further work after we reach net zero. Stephen, I presume SSE is planning to be around in 2050, and back to Peter's question, he's asking whether science-based targets are the solution to balance that more 2030 versus longer term net zero mandate. Would you agree with that?
Absolutely, Thomas, and I think as you know, like SSE have adopted science-based targets. So by 2030 we're looking to reduce our carbon intensity by over 60%, which is significant. But the reality is the technology is here now. When we look at our sector, which is obviously electricity generation and networks, the reality is the turbines have now got to the lowest cost of electricity that's on the market. When you look at how they've actually fallen over the last 10 years, the technology is there. From an Ireland and UK point of view, we have the resources. We have the best wind resource in the world, particularly off our coasts. And when you look at our seabed, we've 10 times the size of seabed that we have of land in Ireland. So, I see it as, from an SSE point of view, a real responsibility, but also from an Ireland Inc. and a UK Inc. point of view, as a really true responsibility to be catalyst for systemic change to a greener society. So the idea of going, looking out beyond 2030, 2040, 2050, is obviously incredibly important, but the time for action is now, and particularly in the energy sector, the electricity sector. The technical challenges, the inhibitors, while they're there to be resolved, the majority of them have been resolved. There's still some challenges around storage and renewables and intermittency and how it integrates to grid, but these are all challenges that can be overcome. The reality is there's a huge opportunity for electricity to really accelerate and to come in a lot earlier than 2050 to deliver on its net zero ambitions. And let's not forget, electricity generation is currently only around 25%, 27% of the total emissions when you look at a global level. The challenges of transportation, manufacturing, farming, heat, these are all other areas that we now need to see accelerated and to be getting home with. But from an SSE point of view, yes, we will be here in 2050. And yes, we won't be waiting until 2050 to deliver on our targets. We're pushing to 2030 and beyond to ensure that we are true catalysts of this systemic change that's required to get to a green society.
Of course, thank you. And obviously, where there's only 3 minutes left, the best questions turn up. So this is a big challenge we have. But I'll ask one question each. They're all different. I'll start with you, Fiona, because I know you are live on another session very soon. But I want to put to you a question here. From Antonietta. It's about this balance between each country's own sort of strategies and initiatives, but at the end of the day, we're working with global supply chains. Again, how do we balance that disconnect or potential disconnect between the perception that maybe some countries are offloading their emissions down their supply chain to more to countries that are less down the net zero agenda? Is that fair, and how does that get squared?
Yeah, and it's obviously a question that I think is a very hot topic. It's a brilliant question. I think that's where Race to Zero really looks to connect the dots rather than break down silos. And ideally as well, I think from a COP perspective, the success of COP will lie in radical collaboration, in action that we haven't seen to this extent before. And that's not just across countries, but it's across stakeholders, it's across generations, it's across regions, it's across sectors. And I think it's really crucial to remind ourselves that this question is about the absolute most that individual organizations can do themselves to tackle abatement and focus on their emissions reductions. And then from a global perspective, the net zero sharing will come from leaders who are able to develop these technologies that we will need, and financial investors who can invest in nature-based solutions, and organizations that are leading in being able to develop these solutions and share those across the world. So to me, it's moving away from this sense of putting the actions and the blames on others, and rather taking on in a very ambitious way, leveraging the influence and the impact that individual actors can have, and encouraging them to take the lead so that they can share those successes with others, rather than pushing their responsibilities down the supply chain. So it's crucial to promote that collaboration, to connect the dots, and really together deliver on the promise of Paris. It's not about one stakeholder, not about one region delivering, it's all together that will achieve that.
Absolutely, absolutely. Thank you. Suzanne, there's a question here about the taxonomy, but I don't know, it's probably quite a complicated one for answering in 1 minute, about the role of natural gas and forests within the taxonomy. So I don't know if you want to say something about that, whether they should be included or not, if you have any strong views either way, because I think it's one that probably requires a lot of thinking.
Yeah, it's probably more for one-on-one discussion maybe, and it's also not that much of what I mean. I can share my personal level of knowledge, but it's for UNDP. Our client countries are not European countries, so it's nothing, at least, that we are working on as UNDP.
Excellent, thank you. And Stephen, I'll ask you the last question in 30 seconds, just before time's up. It's in relation to the collective voice of business. So Fiona was talking about advocacy, and what do you think would be a successful outcome of COP26 when it comes to the collective voice of business?
I think in the first instance, when we look at business, that business see this as a huge opportunity to deliver a win-win, both for our economy but also for our environment. And I think that's absolutely critical to building a cleaner, more sustainable society for future generations. I think also it's about actually seeing governments and actors right across the patch actually moving from promise and ambition, which is really important, don't get me wrong, but moving to real clear action with meaningful progress. I think that's really, really important. And I think the last thing is, I don't think we should ever underestimate, the ability, if we get this right, COP26 is a success, if we see real great leadership right across the globe, this will inspire, this will galvanize, all sectors of society, both young and old, to really get behind this challenge that is climate change, and to really society to deliver down on net zero. So a lot there, but I think it's a critical time, really important time, and if we can deliver those outcomes, I think it will be a phenomenal success.
It is, and I'll have to bring this to a close in a very quick way because it's 12:01 and I can see already people are dropping off. So evidently much more needed space for conversation. So I would like to thank Fiona, who had to run to her other session. Thanks Suzanne, and thanks Stephen for being part of the conversation today. There's clearly much more to talk about. There is, I hope that there will be more opportunities to have further conversations within the context of how COP is coming. So just to say again, thanks for joining us and looking forward to more of these sessions, and have a great rest of the day. Goodbye.
Thanks, Thomas. Thanks, everyone.
Bye.